They say up here for thinking and down there for dancing. And I think that must be your martial art.
Oh, that's very unkind. Now, for someone who's just talked to us about capoeira, where I understand your rituals are called a joga or a dance, but I think it's equally true. Aikido, I think, is the crappiest martial art that I've ever done. And really, I think largely it's a ritualized form of a dance. Let me tell you why I started Aikido. Look, I thought it was something that looked neat. I thought it was fantastic. I saw some films with Steven Seagal, and he was able, with only one hand, to take out a whole aircraft carrier. I thought that's a martial art for me. But when I started doing it, I realized that it's really far from a perfect martial art. And I tell you that because with the martial art, you expect to have a complete system of fighting. And that means you expect to understand when to recognize that there's danger, to know how to engage and to enter in a fight, and to know how to finish the person off. Now, I never realized this.
Well, what is it? A useless arts degree? Is that what it is?
It's a bit like that. And you know the value of a degree by who eventually has to pay it off. If it's the person who's making money from it or the taxpayer. And I think Aikido was a little bit like that. Now, for a start, in the old days when Aikido was founded in about 1920s when it was codified in Japan, okay, it was expected that you already had a black belt in a striking martial art before you have admission to join the school and to learn the ritualized dancing, etc. Now, what that means is the whole art of atemi, which in Japanese is a striking. So from Miss Piggy, she used to do the karate chops,
yep.
or for karate with the
It was
chops.
actually a pork chop.
It was a pork chop. But none of that is in the Aikido, which I learned whatsoever at all. But it was expected that you already knew it. Like they said in Aikido, the atemi, the striking, is implicit. So you had to know it. So basically, if you're fronting up on a Saturday morning, 10 o'clock in the morning by a river, and you're learning Aikido, they're not teaching you the good stuff. It's just like that first job you ever had when you used to put the stickers on the rude parts of women
That's right.
for a living.
That's all I could get as a student.
That's how I see it.
It kept you from the higher tax bracket. So who was the philosopher who said about first mathematics? That's really the same with
Yeah,
martial
that's
arts.
true. In the original Greek university, it was said before you enter, please make sure you've first studied mathematics. And really, it's a bit like that with Aikido as well. Anything with the art of Atemi. Now, for me, I've gone on to do some karate, taekwondo, Muay Thai, and an awful lot of boxing as well. And so I can understand from my peripheral vision what Aikido is supposed to be. Now, when it was started off, it came from other martial arts, other fighting arts, and really it was the act of swordplay. But I ask you, Emmett, how useful is a martial art that is based on swordplay if you don't actually get to have a sword on horseback?
Well, how many were on horseback in the 30s?
Okay, well, have a look at the basic Aikido kit. So you get the tanto, or the knife. You do get the bow. Now, this is great, but if you don't have one of these at home, kids, just grab the broom handle from your mother's Sabco broom
A Nimbus 2000 Harry Potter.
and you're good to go. Now, it puzzles me when I ask people what they expect they could do with this in a fight, and they all tend to want to clobber people over the head with it. It's not for that at all. Imagine if you've got it by the end and you're actually going towards someone's neck and you're twisting it so it's pivoting at the same time. That's really what the use of a bow is. And the other thing which you see in quite a few Japanese martial arts, Kill Bill films, etc., the katana. Now, you don't get to use this a lot. There is actually a Japanese martial art which is all about one thing only, and that's the 5 seconds it takes to beautifully and ritualistically draw your katana or your sword from the scabbard. That's a whole Japanese martial art. So you're not going to learn a whole lot of the katana in Aikido. But what you will learn is how to use your opponent's body as though it is the hilt of a sword. It's very interesting.
So you're throwing shadows.
Well, you are. Mostly you're throwing yourself or letting other people throw you. There's an awful lot of cooperation involved in Aikido. Now, every time that I go to do shadow boxing, the first thing I'll do is some basic Aikido warm-ups. And that's things like perfect symmetry and the flow of watching your hand fall before you. Now, it seems a bit ridiculous, but when you start to think, what you're doing is practicing the position that your opponent's hand will be in when you go to throw them or turn the body, it does make a little bit more sense. And the analogy is that what you're doing is using the wrist of your opponent as you would the pommel of their sword or the pommel of your sword. So a lot of the drawing of a sword. This movement you'd know from Shotokan Karate. It's the drawing of a sword, or a lot of that's similar with Aikido as well, with the exception that you're not fighting somebody with a sword. You don't have to have a sword. And the amount of cooperation, Eamon, where you are allowing someone to enter your space rather than move out of the space, and then asking them to cooperate and give them freely your limbs, it is just mind-blowing.
It's kind of sycophantic. And I mean, you're not just buying into a game, you're suspending disbelief, really. And the amount of times I've seen you come back and say, I learned something today, grab my hand.
Yes.
Do you want me to grab your hand or pull your finger?
Well, look, one of the defences I had for it was that if it's defence from, say, your drunk Uncle Bob, and he goes in with that slow lurch, you can certainly subdue him and bring him down to the ground safely. But I was speaking to a boxer who said, yeah, or you can wrestle them. And that's really a perfect thing. Well, wrestling does exist. So is it really necessary for Aikido? I mean, Aikido, the harmony of energy and the way. I sort of understand it, what it's all about. It's a way of, they say, bettering yourself, fighting against yourself, but also bringing the other person who's your opponent to a way of safety. And a lot of it's analogy of saying, well, when you're moving your opponent and you're standing behind them and actually turning their body, and you're behind their shoulder, and your arm is following their eye line, you are seeing through their eyes. Yeah, but this is a fight, remember, ladies and gentlemen.
Someone in your class once told me what happens when balance is lost.
Yeah.
What did he say?
Well, I don't know what he said.
He said when the center of mass exits the base. Now, I don't know whether he was talking spiritually or he was just talking as an engineer.
It's very metaphorical. I mean, they always talk about the weight being underside. Now, that's something which I actually think does work, in that if I go into a fight in boxing, for example, I'm not hunching my shoulders up, and it's very much the same if I'm playing uke or the receiver in Aikido. I'm keeping my hands level, my shoulders down. I'm not holding my head up too high, for example. What they say is the weight is kept underside. I'm keeping my balance. Except you also use that principle for the exact opposite, to trip up and dislodge the balance of your opponent. But, you know, I work in a very competitive environment with people for what I do professionally. And I find simple principles like even keeping the weight underside means that I'm conscious of my breathing. I'm conscious of what my focus is. It's very allegoric. It's very metaphorical. This whole stuff about chi or ki, you know, this thing about energy. And an Aikidoka, it's a person who plays Aikido, will always say, ki is extenuating, or ki is continuing. So whatever you do, if your limbs are elevated, you're thinking that the ki is flowing right past the horizon of the earth and will eventually come back, or whatever it is. Again, that helps with the idea of the weighting of the body, but also the intent as to what you're doing. But you see, if you already practice as a martial artist and you practice with artemi or with striking, you understand, well, the first things first is you get out of the way of a strike, and then you can bring the person safely down to the ground.
All this time you wasted on ceremony, dusting down the mats.
There was a lot of that. The shikoku, I think they called it, and if you said it the wrong way in Japanese, it actually meant to piss on the mats. So you had to be very careful with that practice and the way you spoke.
Was your martial art the kind where if you want to go up half the belts, all you got to do is buy a uniform, and then you're no longer standing at the junior end of the line? You're now
Not exactly. There wasn't the glorified rainbow of revenue we talk about in things like karate, where you go through an incredible plethora of belts and colours and you're spending money every time. In most forms of Aikido, they're simply the white belt or the black belt. And that's basically it. When you get to the black belt, you get to wear the ceremonial dress. But look, some of the fantasy that I saw, you'd watch a Star Wars film and think someone is taking the piss from somebody. I saw an old chap, and he thought that he was waving off people with swords, and he firmly believed that what he did was real, and he firmly believed that the people who were engaging with him, running towards him, giving all of their energy towards him, that he was subduing them. And this man, he had an orgasmic look on his face. I've never seen someone in such a rapture. But really, it was a bit of a piss take to look at. Steven Seagal, if you see some of the martial arts that he does, his Aikido is a little bit different. For a start, I grant it, he is an authentic black belt. He was trained in Japan, and I've seen some of the fighting that he's done, and it's fair dinkum. But This is a man who relies very much on his own body, on his height, on his size, on his physicality. He's practicing a very, very physical form of Aikido. So he's not relying so much of, let me tell the analogy. Karate, one person comes against you, you go against them. Judo, one person pushes, you pull. Aikido, a person goes against you, you turn in a circle. He's not so much dependent on that. And a lot of his entries into fight was using pure brute force and mass to bring the other person down to the ground, not necessarily in a very safe way. I think of all the time that I spent doing this, I really could have learned an awful lot more just practicing proper martial arts like wrestling, like jiu-jitsu, like even judo, which I think is fantastic in just how powerful it is in annihilating the threat that you have.
Is the whole thing an elaborate bluff? Or if you saw someone who trained that style, Aikido, would you actually say by the way they walk into port, they've got a confidence or way?
They've got a false confidence. It's certainly not an elaborate bluff if you first have an artemi martial art that you're very, very practiced and seasoned in. Then it gives you the option of being very kind when you engage with somebody. And still to this day, I mean, it's used by some of the Australian government for enforcement, and it's still the only martial art which is taught by the Japanese government, again, for law enforcement. So again, in everything for Aikido, the art of the strike is implicit in it. If you don't have it, you are deluding yourself. If you do have it, it leaves a lot of options on the table for you.
I still think that capoeira was the laggard.
Love to know what you think. Thanks for joining us at Susology. We've got a lot more ventures in the can for you and a lot of goodies planned as well. We'll see you soon.
Cheers.